Occupied France, August 1943. The early morning light, just after 0600 hours, painted the dispersal fields of Yogdageschwader II with a pale, ethereal glow, a stark contrast to the brutal realities awaiting them high above. A reconnaissance Dornier had reported the familiar contrails forming over the English Channel, an unmistakable signature of another American bomber stream heading east. For the pilots of the Luftwaffe, these formations, composed primarily of the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, represented not an existential threat, but rather an opportunity for accumulating Abschusse, victories that fueled careers and national morale, a perception that would soon be violently, irrevocably shattered. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, a Staffelkapitän with 18 confirmed kills, ran a gloved hand over the smooth, cool metal of his Focke-Wulf FW-190A5. His technical briefing from the previous evening had reiterated the prevailing intelligence. The B-17, despite its formidable appearance, was a lumbering giant, slow and relatively unmaneuverable, designed for defensive formation flying rather than individual combat. Its speed, a documented 287 miles per hour at altitude, seemed almost leisurely compared to the FW-190's 408 miles per hour. This perceived disparity in performance fostered a dangerous overconfidence, a belief that these American heavy bombers were essentially targets waiting to be dispatched. Richter's pre-flight check continued with a practiced efficiency, his eyes scanning the instrument panel. The FW-190, with its powerful BMW 801D2 radial engine delivering 1,700 horsepower, represented the pinnacle of German fighter design, a machine built for speed and devastating firepower. Its armament, two 20mm MG-151 20 cannons and two 13mm MG-131 machine guns, was considered more than sufficient to dismantle any bomber. Early encounters had reinforced this view. Isolated B-17s, separated from their protective formations, had indeed proven vulnerable, often succumbing to concentrated fire within seconds. The strategic implication of this assessment was profound. Luftwaffe High Command, informed by initial combat reports and technical analysis, had largely underestimated the B-17's inherent resilience and the tactical evolution of its defensive capabilities. Production logs indicated a steady increase in B-17 output, with Boeing, Douglas, and Vega collectively delivering over 300 units per month by mid-1943. Yet the German response focused on increasing fighter production rather than fundamentally re-evaluating bomber vulnerability. The prevailing doctrine favored aggressive head-on attacks or swift passes from the rear, tactics designed to exploit perceived blind spots or structural weaknesses. Richter climbed into his cockpit, the leather creaking softly under his weight. The scent of aviation fuel and warm oil filled the enclosed space. He adjusted his harness, the straps tightening across his chest. The mission, as always, was interception and destruction. The B-17s were merely the slow, heavy prey, their demise a foregone conclusion. The initial reports filtering back to Luftwaffe Command were often met with a degree of skepticism, or perhaps a failure to fully grasp the emergent threat. German pilots, accustomed to the relatively fragile airframes of British bombers and their smaller defensive armament, frequently underestimated the B-17. The early engagements over the Reich and occupied territories, particularly in late 1942 and early 1943, presented a new kind of aerial combat, one where the expected outcomes of a fighter pass were frequently inverted. These early encounters established a pattern that would become all too familiar. The B-17, despite its considerable size and moderate speed, proved remarkably difficult to destroy with a single conventional attack. Fighter pilots, pressing their attacks from astern, often found their cannon shells and machine gun rounds impacting the bomber's airframe with what seemed to be a disproportionate lack of effect. Damage reports from returning German fighters frequently noted numerous hits on B-17s that nevertheless continued to fly in formation, sometimes with engines smoking, but never breaking formation or falling out of the sky as readily as expected. The B-17's internal structure, a testament to its design philosophy, played a critical role in this resilience. Its semi-monocoque fuselage, constructed primarily from aluminum alloys, incorporated multiple redundant spars and stringers. The wings, deep and robust, housed self-sealing fuel tanks, a revolutionary feature that significantly reduced the risk of catastrophic fires from penetrating rounds. These tanks, layered with vulcanized rubber, swelled upon impact, attempting to seal punctures and prevent fuel leakage, a stark contrast to the unprotected fuel cells in many contemporary aircraft. Damage assessments, compiled from post-mission debriefings and photographic reconnaissance, frequently documented B-17s returning to base with hundreds of bullet and cannon shell holes. One operational analysis from the 8th Air Force in early 1943 detailed a B-17G Memphis Belle that completed 25 missions, enduring damage ranging from flak-riddled wings to shattered plexiglass and torn control surfaces, yet consistently brought its crew home. This structural integrity, combined with the strategic placement of critical systems, meant that a B-17 could absorb punishment that would cripple or destroy lesser aircraft. Compounding this structural robustness was the formidable defensive armament, the B-17E, the first variant to see significant combat in Europe, mounted 9.5 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. Later models, like the B-17G, increased this to 13 such weapons. These heavy machine guns, firing armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds at a cyclic rate of 750 to 850 rounds per minute, created a dense, interlocking field of fire around the bomber formation. This was a significant departure from the typical .303 or 7.92 mm machine guns found on most European bombers and fighters. The sheer volume and caliber of fire from a B-17 formation quickly became apparent to German pilots. Interrogation files of captured Luftwaffe pilots frequently contained accounts of attacking a bomber from what was considered a safe distance, only to have their aircraft peppered by heavy caliber rounds. The .5 caliber round, with its greater muzzle velocity and kinetic energy, possessed a significantly longer effective range and striking power than the smaller machine gun rounds, capable of penetrating engine blocks and fuselage armor, of attacking fighters at distances where the German pilots believed themselves relatively secure. The effectiveness of this defensive firepower was not just in the individual gun, but in its collective application. B-17s flew in tight staggered formations, known as the combat box, specifically designed to maximize overlapping fields of fire. A single fighter attacking a formation would not just face the guns of one bomber, but potentially those of several, creating a lethal cone of fire that was difficult to penetrate without sustaining damage. This collective defense transformed the individual B-17 from a slow target into a node within a flying fortress, a concept that defied conventional fighter tactics. This unexpected resilience and the surprising lethality of the B-17's defensive armament forced a re-evaluation of Luftwaffe tactics. Initial assumptions of easy kills against flying railway carriages were quickly dispelled by the mounting losses of experienced fighter pilots and damaged aircraft. The anomaly of the B-17, a heavy bomber that fought back with unprecedented ferocity, demanded new approaches to aerial combat. The B-17's defensive posture, its very ability to survive the gauntlet of the Reich, was predicated on the M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun. This weapon, a design rooted in John Browning's work from the close of the Great War, had evolved into a formidable instrument of aerial defense. Its operating principle was simple yet robust: short recoil, belt-fed, air-cooled, firing from an open bolt. The M2HB, the heavy barrel variant, was particularly suited for sustained fire. a necessity when engaging fast-moving interceptors. Each .50 caliber round, a cartridge designated 12.7 x 99 mm NATO, weighed approximately 4.5 ounces and contained a 700-grain projectile. The muzzle velocity, depending on the ammunition type, averaged 2,900 feet per second, delivering a formidable kinetic energy of over 10,000 foot-pounds at the barrel. This energy translated into substantial penetration against the light alloys and unarmored components of German fighter aircraft. The cyclic rate of fire for an aircraft-mounted M2 was typically between 750 and 850 rounds per minute, though sustained bursts were limited by barrel heating and ammunition supply. A typical B-17G, the most prevalent model by late 1943, mounted 13 such weapons. 2 flexible guns were positioned in the nose, often manned by the bombardier and navigator, offering forward and lateral coverage. 2 more were situated in the top-mounted Sperry A-1A turret, providing primary overhead defense with a 360-degree traverse. The chin turret, a Bendix remote-controlled unit, added 2 more forward-firing guns, greatly enhancing the bomber's head-on engagement capability, a critical response to German tactics. Amidships, 2 waist gun positions, one on either side of the fuselage, offered lateral defense, though their effectiveness was often hampered by the cold, wind, and restricted movement of the gunners. Below the fuselage, the Sperry Bull turret, a marvel of compact engineering, housed 2 more M2s, providing critical ventral protection against attacks from below. Finally, the tail gunner, in his enclosed position, commanded 2 guns, covering the bomber's vulnerable rear arc. This distributed armament created a dense, interlocking field of fire, a sphere of lethal projectiles designed to deter and destroy. The strategic placement of these guns was not arbitrary. It was the result of hard-won experience and analysis of combat reports. Early B-17 models, with fewer guns and significant blind spots, had suffered disproportionately. The evolution to the B-17G represented a continuous effort to eliminate these vulnerabilities, to ensure that no approach vector remained undefended. The sheer volume of fire, the potential for over 10,000 rounds per minute from a single formation of bombers, was intended to create an impassable barrier. The ammunition itself was a critical component of this defensive strategy. Belts were loaded with a mix of armor-piercing, AP, incendiary, I, and tracer, T rounds. The AP rounds were designed to punch through engine blocks and armored cockpits, while the incendiaries were intended to ignite fuel tanks and hydraulic lines. Tracer rounds, glowing bright red, allowed gunners to walk their fire onto target, though they also served to reveal the bomber's position to the enemy. This varied payload ensured that every hit had the potential for catastrophic damage. The sheer mass of metal projected by a B-17 formation was staggering. A single bomber carried, on average, 5,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. A formation of 300 aircraft, a common sight over Germany, therefore carried 1.5 million rounds, a colossal expenditure of ordnance designed to protect the payload of bombs. The psychological effect of facing such a wall of fire was often as potent as the physical damage inflicted, forcing German pilots to break off attacks or approach from less advantageous angles. The M2's reliability in extreme conditions, from the freezing altitudes of 25,000 feet to the jarring vibrations of combat, was paramount. Its relatively simple mechanism meant fewer stoppages and easier field maintenance, crucial factors when a gunner's life and the lives of his crew depended on continuous operation. The weapon became an extension of the bomber, a bristling porcupine of steel and lead. The lessons learned over the shattered landscapes of Europe, particularly the brutal winter of 1943 to 1944, forced a radical reevaluation of American aerial defensive doctrine. Early assumptions regarding the inherent invulnerability of heavily armed bombers operating in daylight proved tragically optimistic against the evolving tactics of the Luftwaffe. The initial strategy, relying on individual aircraft armament, quickly yielded to the grim reality that uncoordinated firepower, however potent in theory, was insufficient to deter determined interceptors. Damage reports from early missions consistently highlighted patterns of attack, revealing that German fighters often sought to exploit gaps in bomber formations, concentrating their fire on isolated aircraft or those on the periphery. This vulnerability underscored the critical need for a cohesive, mutually supporting defensive structure. The B-17, with its 10 to 13.50 caliber machine guns, was formidable only when its individual arcs of fire were integrated into a larger, interlocking web. Analysis of gun camera footage and post-mission debriefings by the 8th Air Force's Fighter Command and Bombardment Divisions provided the empirical data. It demonstrated that a lone B-17, even with its full complement of gunners, could be overwhelmed by a coordinated assault from multiple angles. The rate of fire from a single N2 Browning at 750 to 850 rounds per minute was impressive, but its effective range and cone of fire were finite. The challenge lay in multiplying this individual capability into a collective, impenetrable barrier. The solution coalesced around the concept of the combat box formation, a geometrically precise arrangement designed to maximize overlapping fields of fire. Each B-17 was positioned relative to its neighbors, such that every quadrant around the formation was covered by multiple .50 caliber machine guns. This wasn't merely about proximity. It was about angle and elevation, ensuring that no fighter could approach without entering the lethal envelope of several bombers simultaneously. This tactical shift was not without its difficulties. Maintaining such tight formations, especially in turbulent air or under sustained attack, demanded immense skill and discipline from pilots. Fuel consumption increased, and the risk of mid-air collision, though statistically low, was a constant concern. Yet, the imperative for survival outweighed these drawbacks, driving relentless training and refinement of formation flying techniques. The implementation of the combat box transformed the B-17 from a slow target, as some Luftwaffe pilots had initially characterized it, into a porcupine of concentrated firepower. A typical box of 18 B-17s, for instance, could bring over 200 .50 caliber machine guns to bear on an attacking fighter, creating a storm of heavy machine gun fire that few aircraft could endure. The sheer volume of lead, combined with the explosive potential of incendiary and tracer rounds, made direct frontal or beam attacks suicidal. The strategic implication was profound. While escort fighters remained the ultimate deterrent, the improved defensive capabilities of the bomber formations themselves allowed for deeper penetrations into enemy territory and a greater chance of mission success. The cost in human lives and lost aircraft during the period of doctrinal evolution was immense. But the eventual mastery of interlocking fields of fire provided a critical turning point in the air war over Europe. The skies remained a contested domain, but the terms of engagement had irrevocably shifted. The winter of 1943 bled into the spring of 1944, and the pilots of the Luftwaffe fighter wings found the aerial landscape over Germany irrevocably altered. The B-17 formations, once seen as ponderous, vulnerable targets, had become a gauntlet of interlocking fire, a reality that forced a brutal reevaluation of tactics and a heavy toll on experienced air crews. Initial engagements had often involved attempts at close-range passes, a maneuver that, while offering a greater chance of scoring hits, also exposed the attacking fighter to the full, concentrated weight of the bomber's defensive armament. Interrogation files from captured German pilots consistently detailed the shock of encountering the B-17's revamped defensive posture. Early reports from Jagdgeschwader 26 and 2 found pilots underestimating the density of fire, often describing the experience as flying into a wall of lead. The standard attack profile, a head-on pass from slightly above, was designed to exploit the bomber's perceived blind spot directly forward. But this was precisely where the Norden bombsight's protective glass offered an unimpeded field of fire for the two nose-mounted 50 caliber machine guns, complemented by additional cheek and chin turrets on later models. Damage reports from downed German fighters provided stark evidence of the B-17's effectiveness. Analysis of recovered Messerschmitt Bf-109G and Focke-Wulf FW-190A airframes frequently showed concentrated damage in the engine cowling and cockpit area, consistent with direct hits from heavy machine gun fire during frontal attacks. One Luftwaffe technical assessment from April 1944 noted that 78% of fighter losses during engagements with B-17 formations exhibited damage patterns indicative of frontal or near-frontal impacts, underscoring the shift in danger zones. The psychological impact on the German fighter pilots was profound. Unit diaries and post-mission debriefings spoke of the increasing reluctance to press home attacks, particularly against the lead elements of a bomber box. The sheer volume of tracer fire, often described as a glowing net, created a tangible barrier, and the risk of catastrophic damage to the fighter, or worse, the pilot, became a primary consideration. The Luftwaffe command, in response, began to recommend more oblique attack angles, attempting to exploit perceived gaps in the defensive fire. But these maneuvers often reduced the effective firing time for the German fighters. Production logs from American factories confirmed the quantitative increase in defensive firepower. The B-17G model, which began arriving in significant numbers by late 1943, incorporated a powered chin turret mounting 2.5 million caliber machine guns, adding a crucial layer of frontal defense. This upgrade alone increased the forward-firing 50 caliber armament from 2 or 3 guns on earlier models to 4 or 5, a 66% to 150% increase in lead projected forward, effectively closing the perceived frontal vulnerability. The tactical implications were immense, forcing the Luftwaffe to expend more fuel and ammunition per bomber shot down, while simultaneously suffering higher attrition rates. The initial perception of the B-17 as a slow target had been replaced by a grudging respect for its formidable defensive capabilities. The cost of engaging these formations grew with each passing month, a grim arithmetic of diminishing returns for the German fighter arm. Reich Air Ministry, Berlin, late 1943. Captured B-17 wreckage, often meticulously recovered from crash sites across the Reich, became the subject of intense scrutiny within Luftwaffe technical departments. Engineers and armament specialists, poring over twisted metal and shattered components, sought to understand the American bomber's resilience, particularly its unexpected lethality when engaged from certain angles. Initial pilot reports, often filled with frustration and a sense of disbelief, spoke of approaching what appeared to be a lumbering target, only to encounter a sudden impenetrable wall of fire. These detailed postmortems began with the airframe itself, noting the extensive use of self-sealing fuel tanks and redundant control systems. However, the primary focus quickly shifted to the defensive armament. The Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun was disassembled, its internal mechanism studied, and its rate of fire, approximately 750 to 850 rounds per minute, was carefully measured on captured examples. Damage reports from fighter units consistently indicated that engagements from directly astern or from below and behind often resulted in immediate and severe damage to attacking aircraft, sometimes even before the German pilot could register a firing solution. Analysis of recovered B-17G models revealed the implementation of the Bendix chin turret, housing 2.50 caliber guns, a direct response to the vulnerability of earlier models to head-on attacks. This addition, combined with the established dorsal, ventral, waist, and tail positions, created a truly interlocking field of fire. Interrogation files from downed American aircrews provided further insight, confirming the rigorous training in synchronized firing patterns, where multiple gunners would concentrate their fire on a single attacking fighter, creating a dense cone of projectiles. The sheer volume of ammunition carried by a B-17, typically around 4,000 to 6,000 rounds for its 10 to 13 machine guns, represented a sustained threat far beyond what German fighter pilots had initially anticipated from a bomber. Production logs indicated that by late 1943, the daily output of 50 caliber ammunition in the United States alone exceeded 30 million rounds, ensuring a virtually inexhaustible supply for the bomber fleets. This quantitative advantage in defensive firepower fundamentally altered the calculus of aerial engagement. Strategic implications were profound. The Luftwaffe's early tactics, which relied on swift, isolated passes against seemingly vulnerable formations, were proving increasingly costly. The ideological underpinning of German air superiority, predicated on the technical and tactical dominance of their fighters, was being challenged by a weapon system that transformed a bomber into a formidable, mobile fortress. The psychological impact on fighter pilots, who once viewed bombers as easy prey, was significant. With reports of increasing hesitancy to press attacks into the B-17's concentrated defensive arcs, the examination of shredded German fighters riddled with .50 caliber holes provided irrefutable evidence of the B-17's defensive efficacy. The kinetic energy of the heavy machine gun round, combined with its incendiary and armor-piercing capabilities, meant that even a few hits could disable an engine, sever control lines, or ignite fuel tanks. The cumulative effect of multiple guns firing simultaneously was a lethal curtain of steel, transforming the airspace around the bomber formation into a zone of extreme peril for any approaching aircraft. The autumn of 1943 brought a stark reevaluation to Luftwaffe Fighter Command. Early assessments, often based on isolated engagements and overly optimistic pilot reports, had characterized the B-17 as a ponderous, easily dispatched target. This perception, however, crumbled under the weight of mounting losses and the stubborn persistence of American bombing formations. The initial tactic of individual, uncoordinated attacks, relying on the superior speed and maneuverability of the Bf-109 and Fw-190, proved increasingly suicidal against the B-17's interlocking fields of fire. Damage reports from downed German fighters and after-action analyses of surviving aircraft revealed a consistent pattern of severe damage from .50 caliber rounds, often concentrated in the engine nacelles, cockpit, and wing roots. The sheer volume of fire, even from a single B-17, was enough to dissuade a frontal pass, and the formation's collective firepower created a virtually impenetrable box from most angles. This compelled German strategists to devise new approaches, moving beyond the individualistic dogfight ethos that had dominated earlier air combat. One significant adaptation involved the concentration of fighter attacks. Instead of scattered engagements, Luftwaffe 3 and Luftwaffe 2 began to coordinate multiple Staffeln for simultaneous assaults. The aim was to overwhelm a specific section of the bomber formation, typically the lead or trailing elements, with a massed attack from multiple directions. This tactic, while still costly, sought to exploit momentary gaps in defensive fire or to inflict critical damage before the B-17 gunners could effectively respond to all threats. The introduction of specialized weaponry further underscored the shift in German tactics. The MG-151 20 cannon, firing 20mm high-explosive incendiary rounds, proved far more effective than the smaller caliber machine guns against the B-17's robust airframe. Its destructive power could sever control cables, ignite fuel tanks, or disable engines with fewer hits than the .50 caliber machine gun. This led to the rapid re-equipping of many fighter units with cannon-armed aircraft, prioritizing destructive punch over sheer rate of fire. Beyond cannon, the Germans also experimented with air-to-air rockets. The Werfergranate 21, WFR Gray 21, a 21-centimeter unguided projectile, was adapted from ground-based artillery and mounted under the wings of Bf-109 and FW-190 fighters. While slow and inaccurate, its large warhead, containing 38.5 kilograms of high explosive, could devastate a B-17 with a single impact. The intention was not precision aiming, but rather to disrupt formations and inflict damage from outside the effective range of the B-17's defensive guns. Another tactical innovation was the company front attack, or Gefechtskeil. This involved a line of fighters attacking the bomber formation head-on, often from slightly above. Aiming to pass through the formation at high speed, the head-on approach presented the smallest target profile to the B-17 gunners and allowed the German pilots to fire their forward-mounted cannons and machine guns directly into the bomber's vulnerable cockpit and nose sections. While dangerous, this tactic offered a brief window of reduced exposure to the B-17's formidable side and tail armament, the Sturmbach battering ram. Concept emerged as an even more extreme adaptation. This involved heavily armored FW-190s, often stripped of non-essential equipment to carry additional armor plating around the cockpit and engines. These aircraft, flown by highly motivated pilots, were tasked with flying directly into the bomber formation, aiming to ram B-17s if their concentrated cannon fire failed to bring them down. This desperate measure reflected the growing frustration and the perceived need for a definitive solution to the American bombing campaign. These tactical and technological adjustments were not without their own costs. The heavier armament and armor reduced the performance of German fighters, making them slower and less agile, and thus more vulnerable to American escort fighters. The WFR Great 21 rockets, while powerful, imposed significant drag and further hampered fighter performance. Each adaptation was a direct response to the B-17's resilience, a testament to the effectiveness of its defensive armament and the unwavering commitment of its crews. The skies over Germany became a proving ground for increasingly brutal and desperate measures. Reich Air Ministry statistical returns for 1944 documented a stark escalation in pilot losses directly attributable to encounters with American heavy bombers. The initial confidence, born from early successes against unescorted formations, had evaporated under the weight of sustained combat. Luftwaffe fighter units, once formidable, found their operational strength eroding with each successive daylight raid. Operational records from Jagdgeschwader 26 and Jagdgeschwader 2, two of the most active Western Front fighter wings, show a pronounced increase in pilot fatalities and aircraft write-offs beginning in late 1943. While mechanical failures and ground accidents accounted for a baseline attrition, the proportion of losses attributed to enemy action, bomber defense, soared. A single engagement could decimate a staffel, a squadron of 12 to 16 aircraft, and the experienced pilots within them. The strategic implications were profound. Germany's pilot training infrastructure, already strained by the demands of the Eastern Front, struggled to replace the fallen. Training manuals, updated through 1943, began to emphasize evasive tactics and coordinated attacks to mitigate the B-17's defensive fire, a tacit admission of the bomber's lethality. Yet, the sheer volume of Allied raids meant that even perfectly executed tactics offered only a marginal improvement in survival rates. Damage assessments of returning B-17s, meticulously analyzed by Allied intelligence, frequently recorded hits from 20mm and 30mm cannon fire, but rarely catastrophic structural failures from a single pass. Conversely, captured German pilot debriefings and downed aircraft examinations revealed numerous instances of fighters riddled with 50 caliber rounds, often concentrated in engine compartments or cockpits. The cumulative effect of these smaller, faster projectiles was proving devastating. By early 1944, the average operational lifespan of a German fighter pilot on the Western Front had plummeted. Whereas an experienced pilot might have expected to fly dozens of combat missions in 1942, the intensity of bomber interception duties reduced this to a handful of sorties before being wounded, killed, or removed from combat due to exhaustion. This